Hi, my name is Kira Rabbit, and I am the Education Academy instructor at the Calhoun Area Career Center. I am really happy to be with you today to be reading chapter 2 of the book I Wish My Teacher Knew by Kyle Schwartz. The chapter that I am going to read is on students and poverty, building on resources and breaking down barriers. Before I get started, there's little sticky notes in the chapter, and this one says, I wish my teacher knew that I struggle to get to school. I wish my teacher knew that I barely have time to do my homework. So those are just some examples of some barriers that students face that they are sharing. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. My classroom community. The first year of teaching is such a trying experience for educators, but ask any of us, and we all remember that first group of students with a particular glimmer in our eyes. As I tried to figure out exactly what kind of teacher I would be, I found my thoughts constantly pulled to what I could do to help each of my students pursue their interests and dreams. One of my students, Chris, was obsessed with all things science. He even introduced himself as, Hi, I'm Chris. I'm going to be a scientist. Chris's bespectacled grin would greet me each morning, accompanied by an explanation of a homemade experiment or a fact about dinosaurs. While most of my students' eyes willed the hands of the clock to move faster in anticipation of recess, Chris's nose was firmly placed betwixt the pages of a book. As summer approached, I thought of ways Chris could explore his scientific interests, and I had just the right idea. I would find him a scholarship to a summer science camp. With just a few short emails, I secured him a spot in a science-focused summer camp completely free of charge. I was thrilled. I triumphantly announced the news to Chris and his mother after school one day. His eyeballs popped way open and his mouth dropped. You mean I will get to meet real scientists? Chris's mother was equally appreciative. Her son's education was the highest priority. Anything she could do, she would do. After I sent her the details about the summer camp, Chris's mother called me. She remorsefully explained that Chris would not be attending the science camp. With both parents working all day, it was impossible to drive her son to the camp in the morning and pick him up in the afternoon. It was something I hadn't even considered, likely because that would have never been a concern for me as a child. My parents could go into work late or leave early if it was necessary to drive me somewhere. I had only good intentions when I found the science camp, but I was ignorant of the realities Chris faced. Like most students I have taught, Chris was understanding of his parents' situation, but of course he was discouraged. My insensitivity caused an uncomfortable situation. Chris and his parents were disheartened that he couldn't go to the science camp, and I felt responsible for their disappointment. My false assumption that Chris's family had the resources to transport him every day to science camp was something I definitely had to learn from. I now know that as a teacher, I need to work in partnership with my students' families. I learned early on in my teaching career that my blind spots have the potential to cause big problems, even when I only have the best of intentions. Half of our students. Discussing the effects of poverty on students could fill several books and has. As educators and community members, we need to understand the realities of poverty and its effects in American schools. The numbers are staggering. In 2011, 23,544,479 children attending public schools were living in households that met the federal requirements for the National School Lunch Program, an indicator of poverty according to the National Center for Educational Statistics. Statistics from 2013 cited by the New York Times indicate that an even higher number, roughly 51%, of all the children who walk into our public schools each morning live in poverty. With over half of our students living in poverty, it is impossible for teachers to ignore how socioeconomic issues directly impact the learning in our classrooms. nor is it possible to absolve ourselves of the responsibility of addressing it. Poverty is a complex issue, but teachers cannot leave the work of addressing it to others because poverty issues are learning issues. Discussions on how to support our students need to take place at every level, from the White House to the street corner, and yes, into the teacher's lounge as well. We have a responsibility as teachers to address how issues of poverty in order to be truly effective educators. Part of this responsibility is to develop an understanding of the effects of poverty on our students' physical and emotional health, as well as their academic achievement. It is clear that we cannot be effective educators if we do not understand the implications that living in poverty have on a student's school experience. We cannot develop and maintain authentic, genuine relationships with our students if we don't understand how poverty is affecting their lives, both inside and outside of our classrooms. In my own journey to become an effective third grade teacher, it is not enough for me to have content knowledge and well-developed instructional methods. If my students are to meet every inch of their academic potential, I must understand the barriers to education that exist for them. Otherwise, I run the risk of teaching with unchecked biases. I am proud to say that I work in a school building where so many others have dedicated themselves to the same pursuit. On the most basic level, living in poverty means the basic needs of a child: love, affection, stable living conditions, proper nutrition, adequate health care, and a good learning environment are not always being met in an entire community out of poverty. This messy, symbiotic relationship between education and poverty is what we educators need to examine. Poverty, lunch, and the minimum wage. Among the most basic needs of a child is nutrition. We know that children who live in poverty struggle to get adequate quality food. Because of this, the federal government has stepped in to offer this most basic guarantee that children living in poverty who attend school will be fed. The decision to feed our hungry students has altered the way policymakers measure poverty and changed the way educators talk about poverty. If education is your field, you have heard the term FRL. I hear conversations with phrases like, "We are 98 FRL. Our school went from 60 FRL to 76 FRL last year." Educators use these coded sentences as shorthand to describe how much a particular school is impacted by poverty. FRL means free or reduced price lunch. So, how did lunch become a proxy for socioeconomic status? It all stems from a federal meal assistance program called the National School Lunch Program, which addresses the clear link between poverty, food insecurity, and learning. As reported by Children's Health Watch, by kindergarten, food insecure children often are cognitively, emotionally, and physically behind their food secure peers. Sometimes we hear students who qualify for FRL or who live in poverty referred to as low income, under resourced, or economically disadvantaged. These euphemisms serve to shield us from the reality that so many students in our country face dramatic challenges. I argue that we need to confront the brutal truth. When our government must step in and provide meals for students, it means those students are living in poverty. We can change the wording, but the reality remains the same. All right, so now I'm going to read a little piece called "In My Classroom," and this is an excerpt by a school nurse. Her name is Valerie Wintler, and she is a school nurse at the Kunzmiller Creative Arts Academy. So my school, Kunzmiller Creative Arts Academy, is unique because our school educates students from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. This allows me as the school nurse to watch kids grow. It means I am witness to how poverty manifests itself throughout a child's life. Poverty affects our students' learning in very real ways. One of the most observable effects of poverty is hunger. Before we started a breakfast program, each day, 3 or 4 elementary school students would show up in my health office in the mid-morning complaining of headaches or stomach aches. Young students have a harder time identifying that the discomfort they are feeling is directly related to being hungry. But as a nurse, I realized very quickly that these were not symptoms of an illness. In actuality, they were the symptoms of hunger. It was causing students to miss out on learning time in their classroom. My older students are just as affected by hunger. However, years of living with food insecurity have taught them to disguise their symptoms better. Adolescent students who are experiencing hunger act irritably, feel dizzy, or have trouble focusing, all of which could easily be confused for behavior problems. My high school students do not want their peers to know they are struggling with hunger or that they do not have sufficient access to food. I've heard teens say they just do not want to eat or they don't like the cafeteria food, rather than admit that they simply do not have the money to pay for it. Many families at our school meet the requirement to qualify for free or reduced price lunch, but there are still obstacles in their way. Sometimes families do not even realize that the lunch program is available, but other times the paperwork alone is the challenge. That was the case for Brandon. He was a common fixture in the principal's office as a result of misbehavior. One day, Brandon was sent to the office after punching a locker in a moment of frustration. While I treated the wounds on his knuckles, I asked him what he had eaten that day. He answered nothing. As I found out, most days he wasn't eating breakfast or lunch because he didn't have the money. The fixed income his grandmother who was raising him received would have qualified Brandon to receive free lunch, but for many reasons, the forms were never filled out. Of course, now that I know Brandon does not have stable access to food, I make sure he is fed. I am aware this does not address the root causes of his problem, and regrettably, I know that American schools are filled with students who have the same story. When it comes to school nursing, many people think the job entails band-aids and ice packs, but that is just scratching the surface. Our job is identifying and addressing health issues that can affect student learning. My role as a school nurse is to make sure that the students in our school are healthy enough to learn, and many times that means combating childhood hunger. That is why I'm a strong advocate for my students. I cannot stand by and watch our students go hungry. Right, there's another I wish my teacher knew tag. So this one says, I wish my teacher knew that school lunch is my only meal of the day, but the school food is barely edible. In 1946, a growing understanding of the relationship between nutrition and learning prompted President Harry S. Truman to create one of the largest feeding programs in the history of our country. And importantly, he housed it inside our schools. Since its creation, more than 224 billion meals have been served to children inside the walls of our schools. While educators frequently talk about free lunches, few understand the requirements. In order to qualify for free meals and milk through this program, students must live in households earning no more than 30% above the national poverty threshold. The threshold is determined by the federal government each year and does not take into account geographical differences in cost of living. It's the same for the entire continental United States, although curiously, Alaska and Hawaii have a different higher threshold. The eligibility requirements tell us about the income of our students' families. For the 2013-14 school year, this meant that a household of two, say a single parent and a child, will qualify for free meals and milk if the family earned no more than $399 each week or $20,748 before deductions annually. When the child attended school, he would receive free lunches and his enrollment would count towards that school's FRL rate. Let's use an example of a single parent with one child to investigate how this works. In a standard work week, this single parent would earn an hourly wage of $9.97, far above our federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. With some exceptions, if you work for minimum wage, your children qualify for free or reduced price lunch. It could be said that the National School Lunch Program is subsidizing employers who pay the minimum wage by feeding their employees' children. As evidenced by the existence of our National School Lunch Program, the federal government recognizes that students need proper nutrition to learn. But when we dig into the numbers, the program also acknowledges that the minimum wage is not a sufficient wage with which to feed a child. From the private sector to local governments, there is an abundance of opinions on what the ideal minimum wage should be, but seldom is the perspective of an educator solicited or considered. Why should teachers care about the eligibility requirements for the National School Lunch Program and the minimum wage? Because it matters to our students. The minimum wage is a learning issue because it is arguably not a living wage. Half of our students are living in environments with food insecurity. Our school lunch programs provide some meals to hungry students, but only on school days. It is not enough to ameliorate the effects of food insecurity on our students' learning. Food insecurity is defined by the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA, as a consistent access to adequate food is limited by a lack of money and other resources at times during the year. Living in poverty and therefore living without consistent access to nutrition affects a child's academic success because, as a study published in the American Society for Nutritional Sciences concluded, food insecurity acts as a psychological or emotional stressor, affecting parent and child behavior. The rate of the minimum wage and the amount of income in our students' homes affects their ability to eat and grow, and therefore to learn. Teachers need to understand how issues like food insecurity connect to the minimum wage and impact our classrooms so that we can advocate for our students and teach them to become strong advocates for themselves. All right, now I'm going to tell you another kind of sidebar story. This is Britt's story, and it's called What My Teacher Doesn't Know. Many things in my life changed for my family when my mother courageously took legal measures to protect myself and my sisters from my father's abuse. When my father subsequently abandoned our family, suddenly there was no income in our home. The fear of living with an abusive father was quickly replaced by the stress and anxiety of financial uncertainty. Each member of my family had their role to play in keeping us afloat, and it was now my shared responsibility to support us financially, all while trying to pass my sophomore year of high school. Immediately, living in poverty caused me to live under a new burden of secrecy. Struggling financially was not the norm at my large suburban high school. I was not the only one in the same situation. There were several other students who felt isolated in an environment which seemed to be set up to serve students who had easy access to money and resources. It felt like there was an overwhelming assumption that poor students just did not exist. So I learned to hide my family's struggles. I intentionally went through the lunch line last so that no other students would see the register flash $0 and make the connection that I received free lunch. I dropped out of extracurricular activities to spare myself from having to ask for help paying for fees. Each day I told my algebra teacher I couldn't find my calculator instead of admitting that there was no money to purchase one. She never inquired further. Poverty also led to my identity as a student being redefined. After being held in high esteem by my teachers as a dedicated and responsible student for my entire educational career, I was quickly made to feel as though I was insufficient and also a burden. I could feel their disappointment in me every time I did not have the required school supplies or failed to turn in assignments on time. It was remarkably easy for some teachers to assume that I was lazy and apathetic, but the truth was that I was working at a pizza place every night until midnight in a desperate effort to save my family's home from foreclosure. During this time in my life, school was still my top priority. I felt a tremendous personal responsibility to pull myself and my family out of poverty. I knew the only way this could be done was by completing my education. At times, my schoolwork was compromised in an attempt to meet the immediate needs of my family. There were times when I had to make a difficult choice to skip math homework in order to pick up an extra shift at work, which would keep a roof over my family's head for 1 more month. A few teachers and school counselors took the time to investigate what was really going on in my life. The empathy and understanding some teachers showed me during this time made me work harder to do well in their classes. I want teachers to know that students who are living in poverty value their education just as much, if not more, than other students, but we need their support and compassion. Two Americas. Looking at how our nation's schools rank internationally tells a powerful story of how poverty affects our students' educational achievement. Administered every 3 years to 15 Administered every 3 years to 15-year-olds from member countries. The Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, is an assessment that uses student scores to compare the world's educational systems. America's ranking is clearly a cause for national embarrassment. In the most recent data from 2012, our country ranked 17th in the world in reading and 27th in mathematics. The result of this exam tell a global story, but they also help illustrate what is happening in our schools on a national level. When we look closely at the data, we see a story of two Americas, one with highly effective schools for the children of wealthy Americans, and one where schools are failing to meet the educational needs of students living in poverty. Another I wish my teacher knew tag. I wish my teacher knew that my dad works 2 jobs and I don't see him much. The National Association of Secondary School Principals extrapolated the results of the PISA exam based on each school's concentration of poverty. That is what percentage of students were living in poverty. That is what percentage of schools that had a low rate of poverty, 10% or less, have the second to highest scores in the world. But at the same time, as reported by NEA Today, in schools where 75% or more of the students get free or reduced lunch, the reading score was 446. That's off the bottom of the charts, below Greece's 483. Simply put, the United States was both the best and worst schools in the developed world. Apart from infuriating me with such clear inequity, the results of the PISA reveal another truth. In America, we know how to educate children. We are among the best in the world at it. We have the capacity and resources to lead the children who arrive in our schools as 5-year-olds and 13 years later invite them to enter our society as the best educated adults in the world. This ability is the source of our greatness. However, the stark reality is that so many of our schools fail year after year to offer an effective and equitable level of education to children living in poverty. We can do better to educate all of our students, and it needs to start in our classrooms. So some teacher tools. Number 1, a resource and barriers chart. The vast majority of the students at my school live in poverty. Most have basic needs that are not being met, which leads to significant obstacles to academic success. But we limit the power of a school when the negatives are all we see. Too often, our students, especially students living in poverty, come to school with resources we take for granted. As educators, when we start recognizing things like joy, energy, and curiosity as resources and usable skills, we can leverage them in our classrooms. This is not just a fluffy teacher way of thinking, it's real. Think about how much energy and money adults spend trying to get a taste of joy a kindergarten student experiences simply by rolling down a hill. Acknowledging that these attributes are real and valuable is one way to help honor the resources students come to school with. The book Building Community from the Inside Out by John P. Kretzmann and John L. McKnight present the theory that effective community development efforts are based on understanding and utilizing community assets, capacities, and abilities. Kretzmann and McKnight comment, the unique energy and creativity of youth is often denied to the community because the young people of the neighborhood are all too often viewed only in terms of their lack of maturity and practical life experience. Honoring all the resources of our students bring, including their own disposition, strength of character, ambition, and enthusiasm, can help every student feel like an integral part of their classroom community. We can then mobilize and connect the resources our communities have in order to improve the community as a whole. I witnessed my students' ability to inspire and provoke a conversation about realities in our education system through their simple "I wish my teacher knew" notes. Their words, not mine, reached all corners of the globe, proving that even 8-year-olds possess tremendous reserves of honesty and insight that can make a measurable impact. So another "I wish my teacher knew" note. I wish my teacher knew that I hated to go back to the shelter every night and it was difficult to pay attention in class. Most teachers I know think in terms of strengths and needs. We ask, what strengths does she have in math, and what is his greatest need in reading? It is important to know the skills a student already possesses and, on the flip side, the academic gaps a student displays. We need to know where students need support. This type of analysis is certainly useful and necessary, but it is also helpful to think in terms of the resources and barriers that exist. This can be as simple as creating a T-chart and can be done for an individual student or a group of students or a whole community. A chart might look like this. This is an example, of a chart in the book where it talks about the resources and then the different barriers that exist for a student. As you can see in this example, thinking creatively in terms of what constitutes a resource can help us see the wealth students already possess. All students bring positive traits and skills to the classroom. Students who live in poverty are no different. The student in the above analysis might complain when things are unfair. A teacher can use this natural instinct to motivate him academically by focusing on studying powerful leaders who stood up when things were unfair, or by helping explore social issues that matter to him. In my class, we did just that. During a unit on biographies, my student realized there were no holidays that celebrated women. That's not fair, they protested. I harnessed this feeling. Our class embarked on a research project. They chose to study Molly Brown, a local hero who survived the sinking of the Titanic and who was an early advocate for the rights of women, children, and laborers. My students wrote persuasive essays and successfully lobbied our principal to declare an official Unsinkable Molly Brown Day at our school. Instead of dismissing my students' complaints, I leveraged their intolerance of injustice a second time when I invited all my girls to eat lunch in the classroom because there were issues with gossiping that needed to be addressed. The boys called me out. That's not fair, they accused with genuine and loud frustration. It is not fair to treat people differently just because they are a boy or a girl. One student was actually screaming at me. I could have punished him for yelling, but I ended up conceding the point and invited the boys to eat lunch in the classroom the next day. At my students' insistence, our class started both a gentleman's lunch and a ladies' lunch program. Once a month, students who turn in their homework are rewarded with the opportunity to have lunch in their classroom with members from the community who act as role models and mentors. Our girls have had lunch with accountants and computer programmers, and our boys have eaten lunch with architects and financial managers. Since I was able to see their interest in equality as a resource, my students inspired a program that will leave a legacy at our school and contribute in meaningful ways to all the classes that follow theirs. Acknowledging the resources our students come to school with is essential to empowering them to find success. Equally important is looking at the barriers they encounter as they come through our doors each day. Instead of thinking that kid never turns in homework, we should ask what the source of the issue is. With some conversation and investigation, a teacher can spot the source of the struggle and help the child solve the problem. We cannot go home with our students and sit them down and force them to do a math worksheet, but we can help them understand the best time to start their homework, identify a good place to study, and seek out family and neighbors who are able to support them. I encourage you to create a resource and barrier analysis for your students and your school as a whole. Then ask a simple question. How can we use each student's gifts to help our school? Next, ask yourself, what can the school do to tear down some of the barriers that exist? Each child in each school community will have different resources to build on and different barriers to address. But thinking along these lines will help start a conversation which will empower your students. Food drawers and coat closets. I am proud to work at a school that is proactive in addressing food insecurity as an academic issue. As part of our school's fight against hunger, a grant program has made it possible to provide our students with a real fruit snack each day. Our students come to count on this. Miss, is it time for the nectarines? Is music to my ears. Additionally, our school participates in a program called Totes of Hope. Each week, volunteers pick up canned food from the food bank of the Rockies and pack tote bags full of food to send home to 50 families who have expressed a need for food. These steps help bridge the gap for students. Even with all these procedures in place, I still have students who have immediate food needs. I have a simple solution to address this: a food drawer. In my first year, I publicly passed out granola bars when children complained of rumbling tummies or fatigue. That was until one student, Jimmy, threw it back at me and said, "I don't need this, leave me alone." I realized that he was indeed hungry, but by placing a granola bar on his desk, I had effectively announced to the class that he did not have enough food at home. This is another example of my good intentions missing the mark of meeting a student's needs. Not having access to food is never a child's fault, but it does cause real feelings of embarrassment and shame. Jimmy taught me that if I wanted to address issues of hunger in my classroom, I needed to take a different approach. I started a food drawer. I kept it stocked with snacks I buy myself or friends and family donate. I let my students know they can take what they need, no questions asked. My students are stealthy about it and grab food without my even noticing. This allows students to eat in class or to even sneak in the bathroom and eat secretly. Sometimes they eat a granola bar at recess and say they brought it from home. Other times they take graham crackers home in their backpacks. There are many iterations of the food drawer. Some programs, such as Feeding America's Food Pantry, complement the FRL meal programs with convenient food pantries located on site at schools. I know one high school principal who hosted what he called the Peanut Butter Club that consisted of a few loaves of bread, jars of peanut butter, and jelly that students could help themselves to when they needed it. There are millions of teachers who have stepped in and fed hungry students, a fact that makes me proud of my profession. We truly are first responders. Many teachers ensure that food is available for their students when they need it, because a hungry student is not a student who can learn at his or her best. Similarly, a freezing cold child cannot play. In Colorado, Michigan too, it gets cold. On the coldest days, when teachers and students alike lament that a snow day was not given, some of my students come to school in inadequate clothing, wearing sandals to walk through snow or a thin sweatshirt in bitter cold. Our school has a coat closet, or rather several cardboard boxes shoved under a table to respond to this need. We get these coats in many ways. Our local news affiliate, 7 News, sponsors a citywide coat drive every year. Other times, neighborhood churches or families donate jackets. In 2015, Complete Strangers donated 42 winter jackets to our students through a request I made on donorschoose.org. Still, I have a bigger vision for our coat closet. I would love for our school to organize a coat swap where families can bring in outgrown jackets and shoes and swap them for better fitting coats brought in by another family. I would love to see a coat store in the spirit of the Christmas store program run by Mile High Ministries here in Denver. For 23 years, the Christmas store has partnered with families in need to provide Christmas presents to kids. Referred families pick out and pay for gifts at steeply discounted prices. In this way, the school can empower the community to use its own resources to meet its own needs. And with a little help and facilitation, families can provide warm clothes for their children. In the end, our schools need to recognize that students come to us with needs that must be met for learning to occur. The needs your students display might be different from mine. Your students might need calculators to do their homework or backpacks. Adolescent girls might need feminine hygiene products. Some families might need help facilitating transportation to and from school. As teachers, we can find ways to fill all the gaps for our students. Talking about it is certainly easier than doing it, but find out what your students need and find ways to connect them with resources and support. When our schools take steps to meet the needs of students in every aspect of their lives, we ensure that they have the resources to learn. While we are doing all this hard work, we need to ensure that the reality we see is not hidden by the walls of our classrooms. Our governments, our school districts, and the public need to know what it's really like to be a student living in poverty so they can enact policies and deliver services that support our students. This is not something over and above the scope of our duty as educators. It is our duty. Community supplies. At the beginning of the school year, teachers across America pass out lists of school supplies that families are expected to purchase for their children. Have you ever figured out how much it costs to buy all the supplies that you put on your list? How much exactly? How much will that pack of markers cost if the family can't shop around for the best price? How much will a binder cost if the only store a family has access to is a local drugstore? For older students, do you know the cost of supplies for their combined classes? If you don't know, you should. As a former student candidly put it, the problem wasn't the one spiral notebook my history teacher said I needed. It was that every class asked for one. With 3 kids in our family, it would have been $30 worth of notebooks. That was the cost of one of our bills. So every day, I said I forgot my notebook and asked my friends to rip out a page for me. It was embarrassing. There's another I wish my teacher knew. I wish my teacher knew that I cannot write my paper online because I cannot afford internet. As a child, I never knew how much school supplies cost. Not having access to school supplies was never an issue for me growing up, and I gave little thought to it. Like many teachers, I typed up my list of requested supplies and sent it home with students at the beginning of each school year. The policy of a neighboring school, College View Elementary, caused me to rethink my approach. Teachers there do not send long lists of school supplies home with kids. They simply ask each family to contribute a set amount, like $20. At first, that seemed like a lot to me, but then I started asking my students' parents how much they currently paid for school supplies. I'm sure it's not shocking to anyone who has ever taken the crumpled school supply list to the store, but I was surprised when parents told me they were spending $70 to $80 to purchase all the listed supplies for just one student in my class. The number parents reported to me are blown out of the water by the Backpack Index annually compiled by Huntington Bank. In 2015, they found the average cost for supplies and extracurricular school activities for an elementary school student was $649. For middle school students, it was $941, and for high school students, it was $1,402. In light of this, my grade level team decided to try the we get the supplies approach, and families unanimously love it. On the family's end, they save time and money. On my end, as a teacher, I can get the exact supplies that work for my class. And when I'm buying for 30 students, I can get a much better deal. Plus, a class set of rulers or scissors can last years without my having to repurchase. In addition, all the supplies in my classroom are community supplies, which means we pool the pencils and the crayons in one place so they are available for everyone. This helps create a sense of community and teaches students about shared resources. If one student bites off the erasers from all the pencils, and yes, this has happened, then the whole class is affected. On a more practical level, having community supplies cuts down on waste. Glue sticks go dry less often when we all take care of them. Similarly, our basketball team requests a recommended donation instead of a sign-up fee. Families are happy to contribute in non-monetary ways by washing uniforms or setting out chairs before games. Most students turn in the recommended donation, but another remarkable thing happens. Without any solicitation, some families give over and above the recommended donation to cover the costs of students not able to contribute any funding. It is another example of the community supporting itself. The idea of community supplies may not be revolutionary, but I hope it illuminates how teachers can examine age-old school policies in order to make meaningful changes. I encourage you to try out the technique of community supplies. Small but important changes like this one, when added up, challenge the status quo and support our students. Breakfast in the classroom. Another age-old practice that is beginning to be re-examined is how we serve children food. Many of my students have enough food at home, but the truth is so many children in my class do not have the food they need to fuel their bodies. I have students whose only meals are provided at school, which means that after lunch, their next meal is breakfast the following day. That is, if they actually eat those meals. Through the school lunch program, schools are able to provide both free lunches and free breakfasts to students who qualify and have completed the necessary paperwork. At our school in particular, we knew students in need were eating lunch, but few were eating breakfast. When we examined the issue more closely, we realized there were significant barriers to our students getting access to breakfast. First, breakfast was served before school, so if students wanted to eat, they had to arrive early. Second, when students arrived at school, they were given the option of going into the cafeteria and eating breakfast or going outside and playing with friends before the bell rang. As you may guess, many kids chose to skip cereal and a banana in order to play tetherball. That choice might mean a 6-year-old could be hungry and unfocused for an entire morning of learning. The final barrier was social. Even though many of our students struggled with food insecurity, very few felt comfortable exposing themselves as being in need. By being one of the few students to go through the food line at breakfast, students publicly admitted they were hungry. In 2010, some of the barriers to eating breakfast were removed for our nation's students. Legislators reauthorized the National School Lunch Program and titled it Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. One key component was updating the nutritional requirements, but the act also included the community eligibility provision that allows high poverty schools to offer breakfast and lunch free of charge to all students. Any individual school group of schools or entire school district with 40% or more of students who are already identified, meaning their family already receives governmental assistance, can participate in the program. But it is optional, which means that for many students, nothing changed. In 2013, Colorado State Legislature followed the lead of states like Texas and Arkansas and passed a bill mandating breakfast and lunch be universally offered in schools like mine that have 80% or more of students qualifying for FRL. In addition, breakfast would be served after the school bell rang. With the policy change, I saw the impact on my students' learning firsthand. My students can now eat breakfast in our classroom under the breakfast in the classroom model, which means all students are eating a nutritious morning meal every day. Our school went from serving less than 200 breakfast meals a day to serving more than 450 meals a day. Think about the impact. That's more than 250 students eating breakfast each day who might not have eaten before. On any given morning in my classroom, you will see focused students flipping through the pages of their books as they methodically munch on an apple. The ripple effects go beyond quieting the rumbling in their bellies. I now send fewer students to the school nurse with stomach aches or headaches, which means more student learning time. Students have also learned responsibility and teamwork by setting up and cleaning up after their daily community meal. Research on the impact of breakfast in the classroom compiled by the Food Research and Action Center confirms my observations. They cite studies that found students with improved nutrient intake as a result of a program of school breakfast offered free to all students report decreases in symptoms of hunger. The impact of these programs extends even further. Students who participate in breakfast programs show greater improvements in math scores, attendance, punctuality, depression, anxiety, and hyperactivity. Most of my teacher tools focus on strategies teachers can implement in their classrooms, and I understand that rolling out a breakfast in the classroom program will take a collaborative effort by an entire school or community. But I feel so passionately about the program that I want every teacher who serves students struggling with food insecurity to advocate for it in their classrooms, especially since the community eligibility provision gives schools a real opportunity to serve students better. As schools, we are perfectly positioned to fight childhood hunger. I encourage teachers and schools to investigate the realities of food insecurity among their students and treat it as the learning problem it is. As teachers, let's use our voices to advocate for the barriers to healthful meals to be broken down and eliminated. Empathetic questions and individualized interventions. One year around the holidays, a community member offered to adopt a family and buy them Christmas presents. When our school psychologist called the family to find out what type of presents they would like, she asked the mother to think of something for herself. The mother replied, laundry detergent. As it turned out, one of her children, who had significant physical needs, often wet the bed. She did not have enough laundry detergent to wash the soiled sheets and also wash the children's school clothes. Unintentionally, we had discovered that the root cause of her children's frequent absences from school was as simple as her not being able to wash their clothes. This taught me an important lesson about asking empathetic questions. When our students struggle in school, we need to find the root of the problem. And to do this, the first step is to often ask an empathetic question. Think of a child who arrives late to school. Greeting the child with disappointment, hostility, or sarcasm makes the child feel they are the problem. A true inspiration in my life as an educator is local hero Emily Griffith, who started an innovative school in Denver in 1908 for all who wish to learn, which still survives today. In her opportunity school, she hung a sign that read, "Enter your classes whenever you can get here. We know you try to be on time." If educators start with a "we know you try" attitude, we can work from this place to solve the problem. We must try to seek understanding and provide necessary support instead of automatically being punitive. We teachers should work to discover the root causes of why a student is tardy. Focus on identifying what has become a barrier for the student. It could be as simple as what makes it hard to get to school on time. This question is solution focused instead of accusatory. There's a big difference between that and "why are you always late?" If you want to know what circumstances are contributing to a problem, a good rule of thumb is to take you out of the question. Another I wish my teacher knew. I wish my teacher knew that I'm not going to college because I can't afford it. Asking an empathetic question often provides a wealth of information. Maybe the student does not have reliable transportation to school. As the teacher, you can help facilitate a carpool or help figure out a bus route. Perhaps the child just needs help waking up. The school might be able to provide an alarm clock, find an app that can play a loud alarm, or ask a reliable neighbor to knock on the apartment door in the morning. Maybe the child needs earplugs so they can get a restful night's sleep. You can see how asking empathetic questions can open up a world of solutions adaptable to individual needs. Poverty manifests itself in different ways. Geography, family dynamics, availability of resources, and each family's strengths can all dramatically impact a student's experiences, even within the same community. One student's needs can be vastly different from another's. We cannot find out what supports each of our students need until we have the right information. Most of my students, like more than half of all children in American schools, live in poverty. Beyond lacking certain resources, this truth takes a very real emotional and physical toll. But let me be perfectly clear. There is no need to feel sorry for my students. My 8-year-old students perform Shakespeare, write computer code, and launch citywide book drive campaigns. Each student in my classes, year after year, has enormous potential. I wholeheartedly believe a day will come when I will be working for one of my students or even voting for one of them. As teachers, we need to continuously avoid the temptation to make assumptions. Instead, take active steps to understand our students' lives. Teachers play an important role when we educate ourselves in the realities our students face when they live in poverty. We can equip ourselves with knowledge of how poverty in American schools fits into a national context, and we can become advocates to provide resources and support our students need. Teachers are truly on the front lines of poverty. We have a responsibility to do everything we can to ensure all of our students have equal access to a quality education. Understanding the realities of our students' lives may not always be comfortable for everyone, but facing these issues head on is the best way to understand and help our students. If our good intentions backfire, we need to reflect and make improvements. As individual teachers, we may feel that the scope of poverty is too big, and anything we do will barely make a dent. But when you consider that each of us has the opportunity to affect and improve the lives of so many children each school year, it's easy to see how our collective impact can change the world. But it's up to each of us in every classroom to work towards that change. That is the end of the chapter. That was so kind of inspiring because I really do believe that each of us as educators and students have the ability to change the world. It reminds me of the Malala quote, one book, one pen, one person can change the world. So it's really important. And that is the end of chapter 2. I wish my teacher knew. I hope you enjoyed it and continue listening to the other chapters.